Welcome back to week 10 of One Man Selection Committee. In this video series, I pretend that I am selecting the college football playoff each week of the season. I rank the teams based on how well they prove they are worthy of the playoff. I'm big on making the rankings as fair as possible for the teams, so that means no eye test. I solely base my rankings on results. So, let's get right into it. So to get things started, at number 12, I have Baylor. And Baylor just has not been as impressive as the 11 teams that are ahead of them. Baylor has not been able to prove to me that they're as playoff worthy as the 11 teams that are ahead of them. And to expand on that, Baylor had a 3-point win over 70-something ranked West Virginia, and a 3-point double overtime win over 50-something ranked Texas Tech. And Baylor could have made up for those bad performances with a good win, but Baylor just doesn't quite have a good win yet. They have a decent win over Oklahoma State, they have a decent win over Kansas State, and the best team they've beaten is Iowa State, which is ranked 22nd, I believe, in the metric I've been using, teamrankings.com. I'll put a link to that in the description. But I just don't think Baylor has shown me, they haven't shown that they're ready for the playoff quite yet, like the other teams, the other 11 teams that are ahead of them. So, at number 11, I have Utah. And the reason Utah is ahead of Baylor is because Utah has 2 wins that are better than Baylor's best win. And Utah's loss is to USC. USC loss wasn't too bad. They only lost by a touchdown. And they've been able to make up for it with a good win over Washington and a good win over Washington State. And I think that resume is more impressive than Baylor's undefeated resume. I think Utah's proven they're a little bit more ready for the playoff than Baylor has. So, at number 10, I have Michigan. And I'm willing to admit that last week I made a mistake. I did not have Michigan in my top 12, and I should have put them in there. I think the Notre Dame win was so impressive that it doesn't quite make up for the Wisconsin loss. It doesn't. But it makes the Wisconsin loss a little better. The fact that they blew out Notre Dame shows me that the Wisconsin loss was a bit of a fluke. But I treated this, when I was ranking the teams, I treated it like the Notre Dame game was a 1-point win, and the Wisconsin loss was a 1-point loss. I figured that evened itself out. And when I did that, they had a more impressive resume than Utah and Baylor. So I'm not going to punish Michigan for losing to 2 really good teams. They've also beaten Iowa, which is a top 25 team, top 20 team, and they've beaten Notre Dame, and they beat Notre Dame pretty darn good. And Michigan's looked really good recently, and they're starting to prove that they are playoff ready. Will they make the playoff? Very unlikely. But they've been able to prove that they're a better team, and they've been able to perform better this season than Utah and Baylor. That's why they're at number 10. Now, at number 9, I have Oregon. And the reason Oregon is at number 9 is because they have decent wins, but the wins just aren't good enough to get them higher than number 9. They've beaten Washington at Washington. That's a tough game, and they just barely beat them. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to punish that too much, but they didn't dominate. And some of the teams ahead of them have dominated good teams like Washington. And Oregon had a close game against Washington State. I think those 2 wins are still pretty good wins, Washington State and Washington, but I'm not going to give them too much credit for it. The USC win's also very good, or looking very good. The reason Oregon is ahead of Michigan, Utah, and Baylor is because they have 1 loss, and it's to a pretty good top 10 Auburn team. So we're not going to punish Oregon too much for taking that loss to Auburn. Now at number 8, I have Auburn. And Auburn is ahead of Oregon because Auburn beat Oregon. And I love to honor head-to-head games, head-to-head results. I think that's important. What happens on the field is very important. I think we need to honor that. So that's why Auburn is ahead of Oregon. Auburn also has a good win over A&M, and Auburn has only lost to top 10, top 12 teams, Florida and arguably the best team in the country, LSU. Now, the only reason Auburn would not be any higher is because they did look not great in the Florida game. It wasn't a great performance, but we're not going to punish them for losing to good teams, and they've also beaten good teams, so there's no punishing Auburn for that. And then at number 7, I have Florida. And the reason Florida is at number 7 is because they beat Auburn. The Auburn win for them is a top 10 win. And Florida's only lost the top 10 teams. Their resume is better than Oregon, Michigan, Utah, and Baylor just because they've beaten a good team and they haven't taken a bad loss. And you look at those 4 teams, Oregon, Michigan, Utah, and Baylor, and each one of those teams has taken either a bad loss or they really haven't beaten a team as good as Auburn. At number 6, I have Georgia. And the reason Georgia is at number 6 is because they beat Florida. Again, and it's like I'm like a broken record here, but I love to honor, and I think it's very important to honor the on-field results. Georgia beat Florida. That's why Georgia is ahead of Florida. Now, Georgia, Florida, and Auburn were tied in my mind when I was going through these rankings. And when you have a 3-way tie like that, I think I really want to start breaking down which team's actually better by looking at analytics, by looking at how much these teams are winning by considering, for instance, the Georgia-South Carolina game was kind of a fluky game. Georgia really played better. They just somehow lost the game because they had a lot of turnovers. So I looked at the data and I said, Georgia's the better team of those 3 teams. So I took Georgia and I said, okay, we're going to put Georgia at number 6. And then I had Florida and Auburn. And I decided that Florida beat Auburn. That's why Florida deserves the 7th spot. And that's why the 8th spot goes to Auburn. Now, at number 5, we have Clemson. And the reason Clemson is at number 5 is because they have one bad performance, and that was against North Carolina, and North Carolina is not a very good team. The top 4 either has multiple good wins or they haven't had a bad performance against a team like North Carolina. So that's why Clemson stays at number 5. Clemson has one thing that I can pick out and say, okay, that's what's going to hold them back. And the entire top 5 was basically off this weekend. Clemson had to play Wofford, which is pretty much an off game. So there's not going to be much change since last week. At number 4, I have Alabama, and the reason Alabama is ahead of Clemson is because Alabama hasn't struggled in any game, and they have the same best win as Clemson. But Alabama didn't have a close game against North Carolina, so that's why Alabama is ahead of Clemson. The only thing holding Alabama back is the strength of schedule. They don't have that many good wins. Now, at number 3 is Penn State, and the reason Penn State is ahead of Alabama is because they've beaten Iowa and they've beaten Michigan, which are 2 teams that are probably better or somewhat equal to Texas A&M. Penn State has been able to prove that they can beat a good team twice. Alabama has been able to prove that they can beat a top 25 team once. Now, I've changed since last week. Last week I had LSU number 1 and I had Ohio State number 2. And I've realized I made a mistake. I think LSU should be at number 2. And here's why. Ohio State has dominated every single team they've played, and they have somewhat similar caliber wins to LSU. I would say that Ohio State's win over Wisconsin is better than LSU's win over Auburn or Florida. I think that's a way better performance. They blew Wisconsin out of the water, and I think Wisconsin is a similar caliber team to Auburn or Florida, and they blew Wisconsin out of the water. And Ohio State has nothing for me to pick out and say, okay, well, that might hold them back. Ohio State is obviously the best team in the country, and they've performed better than any other team in the country. And they've beaten good teams in Cincinnati, they beat the crap out of Cincinnati, which in some metrics is a top 25 team. In a lot of metrics, Michigan State is a top 25 team, although I might not agree. The numbers agree. They blew out Michigan State. And Wisconsin is a top 10 team in every metric. They blew them out. So I think I made a mistake last week. Ohio State is number 1. LSU is number 2. And just to recap, I have Ohio State, LSU, Penn State, Alabama, Clemson, and Georgia in the top 6. Not much change since last week, except Georgia is now number 6, and I flip-flopped 1 and 2. I've made Ohio State 1 and LSU 2. So it's going to be very interesting to see the committee's rankings tomorrow night and see how similar they are to my thoughts.